so much for coming out. My name is Colin Wright, and I am very fortunate to lead a fairly unusual lifestyle. Since 2009, about a decade ago, a little over a decade ago actually, I've been traveling full-time, typically during that time moving to a new country every 4 months or so. My readers vote on the country, and then I choose the city in that country. And then I go there, and I live as much like a local as is feasible for that particular location. As I'm sure you can imagine, the viability of that effort differs greatly from place to place. But regardless, the idea is to go to these places and to try to see the world from a slightly different angle for a while, even if just for a short period of time, to try to see that different angle so that I can slowly, over the course of my life, three-dimensionalize my view of the world a little bit more thoroughly. And in between those longer duration stays, these homes away from home, that become just homes, I engage in other travel-related adventures. I've taken the colectivos, the long-distance buses around South America, taken the trains around Western and Central Europe. I have visited all 48 contiguous United States at least twice. And one of those complete circuits I did in just 2 months, riding only on Greyhound buses. Okay, there's some of you for non-Greyhound buses. Yeah, it's just as miserable as you might imagine. But again, the idea there is to see things from a different angle. They usually build Greyhound stations in a different part of town than you usually might go to. They take different paths around the country than you usually might take if you're just straight shotting to point A to point B. It allows you to see things that you wouldn't otherwise see. So uncomfortable as it was also incredibly educational in that way. And while I'm engaged in this unusual lifestyle, I also have a fairly unusual career. I primarily write books for a living. I've written over 30 both fiction and nonfiction books. I have a blog called Exile Lifestyle that I still write and have been for about a decade. I have a weekly news analysis podcast called Let's Know Things that I produce and host each week. And I am very fortunate to travel around the world speaking to audiences of 5 and audiences of 5,000 on a variety of different topics ranging from things like intentionality to things like my favorite dead German chemist. I do have one, and I will very happily tell you about him if you ask during the Q&A. Fritz Hopper. So this life that I live today, it's very strange. It's an incredibly unusual lifestyle. It's definitely not for everybody, but it is as close as I have found to something that is custom tailored for me. It's a weird assemblage of different components that I've put together into this Frankenstein-like lifestyle and career, but somehow that Frankenstein monster looks like me. It's the right shape for me and all the things that I want out of life. With all the sacrifices and all the discomforts that go with it, it's something that gives me essentially everything that I want to be doing and that I want in terms of the life that I live, and very few things that I don't. But the life that I'm living today is a far cry from the life that I was living a decade ago. First half of 2009, I was running a branding studio in Los Angeles, and things were going pretty well, actually. According to most businessy standards that we use to judge such things, things were going incredibly well. This was my first successful business. It was the third one that I had run. I learned a whole lot from the first 2 failures. But I was earning tons of money from this business. I had some very big clients that other agencies were trying to steal away from me all the time. I had a good deal of professional prestige and a good reputation within my space, which was really important to me. But the cost of that success was essentially every other aspect of my life. I didn't really have a life outside of work. At the end of the day, I didn't have the energy or the time or the psychological wherewithal, honestly, to have like a hobby, or to have anything that was not connected to work in some way in my life. It just wasn't there. I was wrung out. I was working hard and playing hard. And it got to the point where even when I was able to set aside time to sleep, and this wasn't all the time, I was working 100-hour weeks. During crunch time, 120-hour weeks. If you do the math on that, yes, it's very sad the amount of time that is left over for other things. And my relationships and health did atrophy as a consequence of not being able to invest the time and energy that they deserve as a consequence of that. But even when I did manage to find time to sleep, I opened up my ever so important calendar and marked out tonight, full night's sleep. We're going to recharge the old batteries. I'd just lay there in bed, spinning. And the cloud of stress and anxiety that pervaded my every waking moment were there when I was trying to sleep as well. I was just so stressed out, just thinking all the time of all the things that could go wrong, all the moves that I could make that were the wrong moves, and that I only realized were the wrong moves in retrospect. I felt like I was one missed phone call, one late replied email away from everything collapsing around my head. Just immediately, instantaneously going up in smoke after all of that work, all of that sacrifice, all of that discomfort to get to where I was, running 150% of what I was capable of every single day. I felt pursued. And it would get to the point where I would just roll out of bed at 2 or 3 a.m. and I'd drive across town to my 24-hour gym, and I'd work out as hard as I possibly could to try to physically exhaust myself so I could drive back home, lapse into bed for a couple of hours, and get back up the next day. Do it all over. It wasn't sustainable, not by any definition of the word. But of course, in the moment, I didn't realize that. I think this is something that a whole lot of us do. It's in the moment when we can most use, like a slowdown or a pause, a moment of calm, cold reflection to look at what we're actually doing, that we're least likely to do that. Because we already feel stressed out, we already feel pursued, we already feel like the 150% that we're operating at is not enough, so we need to walk it up to 160. Those are the moments that the idea of slowing down, God forbid, pausing, is just anathema to everything that we're doing. The idea of doing that does not even register. Speeding up, working harder, that's what registers. And so it was fortunate for me, because I certainly wasn't going to stop. It was very fortunate that I had a built-in milestone at that point in that year. I was turning 24 that year, and I'd been running businesses since I was 19. So for the past 5 years, I'd been operating at a similar pace, and I'd never had a vacation. And I decided things were going well, I should do what people do when things are going well, I should have a vacation. The first one of my adult life. And thankfully it was there on that ever so important calendar, so I took it very seriously. And I was able to step away from the situation. Only briefly, but long enough. And I was able to step away and extract myself and look at things from a distance. I was able to extract myself geographically. I left LA for the better part of the week. And psychologically. I mostly set aside work for the better part of the week. And from that big picture view, seeing everything in context for the first time in a very long time, I was able to realize a couple of very important things. First, I realized this was not sustainable. Not if I wanted to live past 30. Like, I really could not physically and psychologically continue to operate at that pace if I wanted to live much longer in my 20s. Like, it just was not something that I could keep doing on a very real physical level. But second, and something that had never even crossed my mind before this period, was I wasn't prioritizing my actual priorities. The reason that I got into entrepreneurship originally has to do with where I grew up. I was originally born in the San Francisco area, but when I was 9, I moved out to Columbia, Missouri. So it's like in the center of the country. And it's a lovely place, but it's also in the Midwest. And as people who live in the Midwest know, it's very expensive to travel from the Midwest. It's something that's very difficult to explain to people who have not lived in any place other than like New York or LA. But for me, growing up, I've always been a big reader, a big learner. I've always wanted to know things. And as I got older and older, I was starting to realize that there's certain things that you can't learn from a book. You can't learn by talking to somebody. You have to get out into the world. You have to go see things, experience things firsthand, actually experience those perspectives if you're actually going to grok what they mean. And I was becoming more aware of these great big gaps in my knowledge web that I could not fill in by any other means, so I needed to travel. But from that perspective, growing up in the middle of the Midwest, travel was a very expensive thing. Travel was a rich man's game. You needed somewhere in the neighborhood of infinity dollars if you wanted to consider traveling more than once a year, just on holidays or for somebody's wedding periodically. And so I needed to earn tons of money, which segued me into the lifestyle that I thought would earn me tons of money. Now, all these years later, though, here I was, living in Los Angeles, a place with a, let's be honest, terrible airport, but a very well-connected international airport, LAX. I lived essentially down the street from it. I was making way more money than I'd made in my entire life. All the pieces were in place. And I still had a blank passport. I'd never been anywhere Like, this is the thing that I used to flog myself forward. Anytime things got really difficult, I said, this is what it's for. You're going to get out, you're going to live, you're going to do all those things that you wanted to do, you're going to fill in those gaps. And I had all the pieces, and I wasn't utilizing them. Somewhere along the way, the means to an end had become an end unto itself. The money that was supposed to help me achieve something had become the point. That had become the score that I was looking at to judge how well I was doing, as opposed to the thing it was supposed to get me. And if I'd been paying attention, I probably, long before that point where I completely burned myself out, I could have already extracted myself from that situation and taken advantage of all the work that I'd already done. So that was the realization that I had. Just as important, though, and a little bit bigger picture, the kind of meta view that I had here helped inform this meta realization. I realized that I could always make more money, but I could never get more time. Now, this is something that, because of the system that we live within an economic system where there's always more money opportunities. It's not always pleasant to earn. We don't always get as much of it as we might want, but there's always more opportunity out there to get because of that system. That is like the lifeblood of the economic system within which we live. Time, though, every single moment that you spend is a moment you can never get back. No matter how much money you have, you cannot get back a single second that you have spent. It's a completely non-renewable resource. And short of us coming up with some new dramatic life extension technology or everybody uploading themselves to the internet or something, could happen. I wouldn't put money on it or put all of my life on it. Short of that happening, there's no way we can get that time back. And I realized that if I had $1 billion sitting in my checking account, that would not buy me my 20s back. Or my 30s, or my 40s, or my 50s, or any amount of time that I spent doing work that was fine, like it was challenging and interesting to a certain degree, but it was also kind of killing me. I could not get that time back, no matter what. And so it suddenly became very important that I not just pivot in some way and change something about the way that I was living to try to reorient myself with those goals that I actually had, but that maybe I should do it sooner rather than later. Rather than continuing to shovel more of my time into this big machine that like ground it up and spit money out the other side, it seemed prudent that I act on that relatively quickly. So when I got back from this vacation, got back to LA, opened up my calendar and set a deadline, 4 months in the future. On that day, I decided I would start traveling, full time, for maybe a year, I thought. You know, I didn't really set an end point on it, but I thought at least a year, I'll try this thing out, see how it works. I've never been anywhere, so I don't know how it'll go. I might not even enjoy it, but I want to give myself that opportunity. And during that 4-month runway in between, I'd figure out all the things that I needed to know. I'd completely change everything else, or change everything up about my life, and make sure that I can take off in the way that I want to. So during that period, I scaled my business down to something I could run from the road. I got rid of like 98% of my clients, and so I was making far less money just working with clients that I could consult with rather than doing the full package stuff I was doing before. But the hope was that I could also reduce my expenses so that that wouldn't matter, and I could free up that time that I was spending on these other things up until that point. I started up a blog called Exile Lifestyle because I wanted to share what I was learning along the way with other people, and I wanted to have kind of a platform that I could use as an excuse to reach out to other people and try to learn from them, learn from people who had done things like this or things that were radically different from this, who might still know things that I want to know along the way. It was a means of reaching out, but also a source of gravity to pull in like-minded people. And it also became an excuse when I realized that I had no idea where to go, an excuse to foist the responsibility of choosing on strangers from the internet. And so I put up a vote, a list of countries, and had people vote on where I should go, because I figured I was the absolute worst person to decide that, not having been anywhere. And so everybody else's decision in that regard would be more legitimate than mine. So it saved me from making that decision, but it also ended up creating a process by which I was able to somewhat randomize the process, for me at least. And I got rid of everything that I owned that wouldn't fit into carry-on luggage. I had a laptop bag, and I had a bag that fit in the overhead compartment of a plane. And that unto itself took essentially the whole 4 months. Like, I had a lot of nonsense. I had a great big townhouse full of stuff. It is what people do when you grow up without money. and then suddenly you have a bunch of money, like all of a sudden, and you don't have the opportunity to slowly transition into that with the hopefully accompanying responsibility that comes with it and respect for it. So I was buying all kinds of stupid things, and I had 2 walk-in closets full of clothes that I never wore. I had a home office that had 8 computers in it. I was the only one using that office. Somehow along the way, I had justified all of these purchases as something that I needed, something that made me, or that showed that I had reached a certain point. And here I was going through getting rid of all of it because I hadn't used this stuff. So a lot of those clothes, they still had the tags. A lot of those computers, I turned them on at one point, but they were like 3 or 4 software updates behind. I never touched them. I didn't use them. And it took me 4 months to go through all of this stuff and give away most of it, donate the rest to organizations who would help me with that. I had this image of myself when I was thinking about what I might do with these things. Because as a lot of people do, at first I thought, well, I'll put it in storage. It's my stuff. But then I pictured myself like paying rent for my stuff, buying a little home for my things, and then like locking them up. I had this image of myself as Pharaoh, like burying my riches, not because I needed them, but so that no one else could have them. Like literally locking valuable things away, not for any real purpose other than keeping other people from utilizing that value. And so I took that time, and I got that stuff in the hands of people who would actually utilize it. And it was very worthwhile, even though it was essentially a full-time job for 4 months. And at the end of that period, I left. And despite all of the discomforts and all of the sacrifices that went into that whole process, but that also goes into the lifestyle in general, that remains to this day, by far, the best decision I've ever made in my entire life. I would do it again 1,000,000 times. It is what enabled all of the other things that I've been able to do since then. It's what liberated so much of my time and so much of the energy that I was formerly spending on things that I didn't actually care about, working toward goals that didn't actually matter to me, so that I could reorient all of that time, effort, all the time, energy, and resources, including money, toward things that actually matter. Now, along the way, a lot of this stuff, a lot of the things that I've learned since have come from experiences that I've had along the way. But core to this entire adventure, as I've alluded to a couple of times, is trying to increase the 3-dimensionality of my vision, trying to make sure that I see things more roundly, because we're kind of born with one perspective. We're seeing things from one perspective in space, based on all the variables that go into where we were born, how we were raised, all the ingredients of our upbringing. And I wanted to make sure that I could move around a bit and see all the places that were in shadow, and see the other side, and try to understand what's actually going on there, as opposed to just seeing a snapshot of it. And along the way, above and beyond just the desire to do so, I've been accumulating different, what I think of as lenses that I can peer through, things that I can use to see the world in a slightly different way, at least for a period of time, that have helped me with that three-dimensionalizing process, and have helped me do it much more effectively, and in some cases efficiently as well. And what I want to share with you tonight is a collection of my 5 favorite of these lenses, things that I have found incredibly useful, perspectives that I found to be incredibly valuable in terms of seeing the world in a slightly different way, and ideally, and usually at least from other people I've spoken to who have used these same lenses, in a way that allows them to see with greater clarity what actually matters to them, and to understand the context in which they actually exist. So the first of these concepts is a lacuna, and lacuna is a Latin word that refers to like a gap or a space between things. Like when you're using it to describe geography, it's like a gulf or a gully. But when you use it linguistically, it refers to a word that exists in one language that does not exist in any other language. So it's a word that you cannot directly translate from one language to the next. A perfect example of this, one that might be familiar because we've kind of stolen it into the English language because it's incredibly useful and versatile, is the German word Schadenfreude. So Schadenfreude, like, it refers to taking a sense of pleasure in someone else's misfortune. And so when you see somebody get kicked in the crotch or slip on the ice and they fall and you're like, for a moment, and then you feel bad, you've just experienced Schadenfreude. This is something, it's an incredibly useful term, it's very German. But it's the type of thing that, unless you had a label for it, you might experience that range of emotion and not recognize what was going on that particular spectrum. You might move right past it because you don't have the term to describe it. That's what's so valuable about lacuna, is that they allow you to recognize things that were always there, but that you didn't have the language to describe. And this is, I'm terrible with languages, but this is why I try to collect lacunas from as many different languages as I can, because they do allow you to recognize things that are always happening around you, and then identify them with greater granularity than you might be capable of otherwise. Another one of my favorites of these comes from Japanese, wabi-sabi. Wabi-sabi refers to a particular aesthetic. It's an aesthetic sense of appreciating things that have lived, and particularly usually things that have aged in a certain way. And when I think of wabi-sabi, I usually think of like a leather journal. You can get like a leather journal brand new off the shelf, and there's a certain aesthetic sense to it. It looks nice. But then you live with that journal. You take it with you places, and you spill things on it. It gets scars, it gets dog-eared. You write on it, you sketch on it. There's this myriad collection of imperfections that accumulate on this thing over the years. And at a certain point, 10 years later, you pull out that journal, and it's like, it's all torn up and miscolored, but it's got its own new type of beauty in a way, doesn't it? In some ways, it's even more attractive than it was when you first took it off that bookstore shelf. There's a different aesthetic sensibility about it that you appreciate because it's aged, because it's been through stuff, because it's lived. It has been eroded by time. Wabi-sabi is the appreciation of that type of beauty in things, in ideas, in people. So looking at somebody who is no spring chicken, but then appreciating them for who they are because they've lived, because they've done stuff, they've learned things, they've accumulated all kinds of beautiful idiosyncrasies. That is a sense of wabi-sabi. Is that wonderful? I love these words. Actually, one of my all-time favorites, thankfully not super useful most of the time, but it's really wonderful. I learned this when I was in Cluj-Napoca in Romania. It's a Romanian term, dor. And so dor refers to a particular sense of longing. And this is a longing for a person who is inaccessible to you, maybe because they're far away, maybe because you've had a fight, and so you cannot communicate with this person for some reason or another, then they are inaccessible to you, and you feel this sense of longing that manifests in a sense of like a bowling ball in your stomach. And the only way to get rid of that bowling ball is to sing sad songs. Dor. Hopefully you never need it, but it's a very specific term that then if you ever do experience that specific feeling, now you'll recognize it, you'll know what to call it. Now my favorite of all the lacunas that I picked up from around the world, though, is an Icelandic word. That word is lífspeki. Lífspeki. Lífspeki refers to the practical philosophy by which you live your life, that you demonstrate through your actions. And that's perhaps easier to understand if I show it in comparison to something else. So when we say the word philosophy in English, usually what we're referring to is a collection of ideas that have put a label over it. And that we've said, I think this collection of ideas are important. These are worth pursuing, worth trying to live up to. They're aspirational. So whether it's some kind of like religious-based philosophy, some type of ideology that's collected and organized, or if it's something that you self-define, or if it's something that's not part of any formal organization, maybe it's like pacifism. Philosophically, I'm a pacifist. That means that you aspire to not hurt anybody, try not to have fights. But it is aspiration. These are not things that we necessarily live up to. Somebody could say they are a Christian and not be a perfect Christian, and they are still a Christian. Somebody could say, I am a pacifist, and go get in a bar fight every night, and they're still a pacifist. They think those things are important. They're just like a bad pacifist. And there's no philosophy police that goes and takes away our labels. If there were, most of us would probably not be able to wear these labels because they are things that we try to live up to. They're not things that we necessarily live up to. That's what we are talking about when we talk about philosophies. Lífspeki is different. You do not tell anyone what your lífspeki is. You show them. Lífspeki is you showing what you believe to the world through your actions. So every single thing that you do and say every single day shows the people in the vicinity of you what you believe. You cannot tell anyone your lífspeki. You show what you believe through your actions. Isn't that beautiful? I love that. This word came to me too at a very important time for me. I'd been on the road a couple of years and things were going really, really well, but I still had a certain amount of discontent where I was having trouble sleeping every once in a while, and I had that sense of anxiety that you get where something in your life is off, but you can't quite place it. It's not world-ending, it's not devastating to you and everything else, but you know it's there. And because it's not horrible, you don't necessarily take the time to really ruminate on it the way that you should. And then I came across this word, and it helped me recognize that the thing that was really messing with me was that my actions and ideas didn't perfectly align in the way that I hoped they would. I thought I believed in certain things, but I was behaving as if other things were actually important to me. And looking at it from the philosophical angle, that was very difficult to recognize because, hey, it's fine. You don't have to live up to your philosophies. It's aspirational. I could just tell myself, well, I'm still working on it. Looking at it from that other angle, though, coming at it from the angle of what am I showing the world I believe? And then realizing that what I was saying through my actions was miscalibrated with what I actually thought about the world and the way I thought I should be behaving. That helped me recognize that I needed to align these things better. I needed to make some tweaks so that I could bring them into alignment and make sure that I didn't have that constant sense of discontent about doing things and then wondering why I felt weird about them. So respect is one of these words that can help you look at your life, can help you look at the world, and then better find your place within it, but also identify things that you're doing within that space that you might be able to tweak in important ways. And that leads into the second concept, intentionality. Intentionality has become a bit of a buzzword of late. It's one of those kind of vaguely spiritual things that we toss around, and nobody really takes the time to define it. So you might find like hashtag intentionality on Instagram, and it's somebody standing on a cliff going like this, you know, like doing something crazy, yeah, doing it, living well, intentionality, rainbow, like, and that might be, that might be living intentionally. If so, that's great. Instagram is serving us well in that case. But really, it's something both more complex and simpler than that. More complex in that it's difficult to live intentionally for a variety of reasons, but simpler in that it's actually a very, very simple concept that doesn't relate to any particular activity. You could go rock climbing, but maybe not. Living intentionally just means doing things on purpose. That's it. Like a super simple concept, deceptively difficult to act. Because doing things purposefully means that you go through your life, you go through all of the things that you do by routine, habit, and reflex, and out of tradition, and you question them. And you say, why am I doing this thing? And why am I doing this thing in this way? There's a lot of things that we do kind of thoughtlessly. Not because we're thoughtless people, not because we're ignorant or slow or anything else. We're not lazy. It's just not something that we're encouraged to do. And usually, we're kind of handed this collection of templates for the way that we behave, the way that we live our life at the beginning of our lives. And we're handed them throughout our lives by people who should know what they're talking about. And they're all incredibly well-meaning people who are trying to help us do different things. They're giving us the rule book for a game that they think we want to be playing. It's just that in some cases, we want to be playing a different game. Or in some cases, they had the rules wrong because they had a Xerox copy that itself was wrong. There are a lot of traditions, there are a lot of reflexes, there are a lot of habits that might serve us in some way, in the sense that they get us through the day or accomplish a certain goal, but they might not serve us in other ways, and that they help us accomplish a goal, but not our goal. Or they help us accomplish a goal, but not in a way that is actually healthy for us. Or they don't help us accomplish a goal at all. They're just something that we do, and we've never taken the time to question why we do it. And it could be something as simple and stupid as, why do I put the spoons on this side of the utensil drawer? I've just always done it that way. I don't know, my parents probably did it that way, and their parents probably did it that way. Well, is that the best way to do it? It might not matter. Some of these things might not matter. It's perfectly fine to leave the spoons exactly where they are, but the point is going through and questioning it. And even things as mundane and probably ridiculous as where you put the spoons in the drawer. Because then that makes it a little bit easier to go through and question the more arguably vital and complex aspects of your life. Why am I doing this work? Why am I doing it in this way? Why am I applying these skills toward it? Is this something that, as I do this work, it helps me achieve those other more distant goals? Is this point A that I'm at right now helping me to get that point B? And am I taking the proper steps to get there? Or are there other steps I could be taking? Is there a better route? Is there a better way to be placing my feet? Is there a way to get metaphorical rollerblades to make sure I can get there faster and snazzier? Like there's all kinds of ways, all kinds of recalibrations and tweaks that we can make to even the most basic, but also the most complex elements of our lives, if we allow ourselves to take a look at these things. That's the hard part, though. Like, it's relatively simple once you do this a couple of times to go through the process and make the tweak and ask yourself these things. Hold up each and every habit and say why, and why this way. But getting started with it is really difficult, because it's, again, not something we're encouraged to do. But it also means that we might come across something that we've invested our entire lives in. Like I spent all those years at school. I spent all those years climbing my way up the ladder. I spent all those years trying to buy a house in this particular area. I spent all those years putting those spoons in that particular spot. We have a visceral revulsion to feeling like we invested in something and pulling away from that investment before we've reached the end. Even if we are not moving in a direction we want to move to, because of that sense of loss aversion, it can seem more appealing to keep moving in the wrong direction that we've already invested in, rather than start moving in a brand new direction that is probably the correct one, but that we have to start over to pursue. That's why it's so difficult. Very, very simple concept, but incredibly difficult to actually make manifest. Now, it's possible, though. It's something that we can actually do, but it takes a whole lot of time and attention, and it can be exhausting. And on top of that, it's not really something that you ever finish. It's something I've been trying to do very consciously for 10 years, and I still find myself all the time doing something that completely does not fit with anything else that I do in my life. And I'll have that moment of realization, like, wow, okay, this is an artifact. This is something that does not fit with the rest of my lifestyle. This is something that clearly fits with me of 15. So I know where it came from, but it's not something that fits with where I am today. And I've resigned myself to the fact that that will be the case for the rest of my life, in part because there's so many little things that we'll only see in certain circumstances, or only catch in certain circumstances, but also because we continue to change. I mean, if we're growing, if we're learning new things, exposing ourselves to new ideas, we will continue to change. Our wants and needs will continue to change. And that means at a certain point, even if you move the spoons over there, at some point you might want to move them back, move them to a completely different position, put them in a completely different drawer. Your wants and needs and priorities might change. And that means that you're going to be consistently recalibrating. It's not a destination that you reach. The journey itself is the point. In that pursuit, there are a lot of more tactical tools that we can utilize in order to live more intentionally. And one of them is my third concept, the third lens here, and that is minimalism. And minimalism, I mean, intentionality has become like a pop culture icon. Minimalism has really become a popular thing. The Netflixification of minimalism has been very interesting because on one hand it's raised awareness of the concept, but on the other hand, a lot of people have a very strange idea of what minimalism is. In part because of the hashtag minimalism too. A lot of people who I speak to about this concept think that it means you have to live in a stark white room with like a potted succulent and like 3 pieces of incredibly expensive Scandinavian design furniture. And that's true. That's what you need. Okay. No. I mean, there's no right way to do minimalism. That's the thing. It's a very difficult thing to explain because we've been sold it as like a branding concept. Or there's a whole lot of other industries and other fields of inquiry, minimalism means different things. If you look at architecture or design, minimalism usually means focusing on the core fundamental constructive load-bearing things so that you don't decorate it. You appreciate the beauty of the structure itself. You appreciate the beauty of the communication within the poster itself, rather than throwing a bunch of extraneous design at it. So there's other understandings of minimalism, but the philosophical concept, which is not new, it's something that's been around as old as human beings, essentially, or at least as old as the ancient Greeks. That concept is a lot more focused on us and the way that we spend our resources. And particularly, minimalism is about focusing on what's most important to you as an individual, so that you can spend more of your time, energy, and resources, very much including money, on those most important things. So it's another relatively simple concept that's been a little bit convoluted because of the way we usually talk about it. But you do not need to own a certain number of things. You do not become morally superior by owning fewer things. I've definitely had people trying to challenge me to minimalism matches. I'm like, dude, You own 12 things? What? How do you brush your teeth? What are you talking about? I've owned a ridiculously small number of things. That's ridiculous to me. Congratulations, you win. No, I mean, there's no right number of things to own. And the way that I usually explain that to people is, if your favorite thing in the world, like nothing makes you happier than this, is unicorn statuettes, that's exactly what you should be spending your money on. You should. Go out and buy the best collection of unicorn statuettes you can find. Get like a display case for them, shine some nice lights, really present those things. Show off the dazzling beauty of your unicorn statuettes. And enjoy them, appreciate them. This is what your money should be spent on. Things that actually fulfill you in that way. And we all have a different thing that's our unicorn statuette. The idea, though, is that you spend that time and your energy and that money on those unicorn statuettes rather than the big screen TV you were going to buy. Like, instead of buying the TV that you were told you have to have, otherwise the living room is not complete, the thing that you're never going to use, or you'll use it in a way that distracts you from the things that you actually want to do, take that money and spend it on the unicorns. Think of the unicorns. Whatever your unicorn statuette happens to be, it's totally legitimate. Like, it's going to be different for every single one of us. For me, my unicorn statuette has long been travel. It's travel, it's being able to have the time to spend on projects that will not necessarily earn me any money. It's being able to sit around and read all day if I want to. It's being able to spend time with people that I care about. Like, that sense of freedom and that ability to live my life in a way that I choose. That's my unicorn statuette. And as a consequence, traditionally, I've owned a lot fewer things than other people because I'm living out of a carry-on bag in some cases. It would be ridiculous for somebody who wanted things, wanted a home, wanted a room full of unicorn statuettes to only own what would fit into a carry-on bag. You would not be happy. Like, we should not try to copy other people's version of minimalism. That's not what it's about. It's not about anybody setting rules and telling us what we can own or how many things. It's us looking inside and saying, what do I actually want? And very importantly, taking the time to establish what we actually want as opposed to what we've been told we're supposed to want. And then focusing more of these resources on those things and fewer of those resources on other things. Because these resources are finite. Our time and energy and money and other resources are finite. So if we're spending them on that big screen TV, we do not have all that TV money to spend on statuettes. Now, that will involve different managing of resources for different people. And it can change the way that you live your life once you start to look at how these resources are calibrated and where you're putting them. I mean, for me, I can travel relatively inexpensively. A lot of my hobbies don't require tons of money. You might have to make different decisions in your life if you love more than anything else to race luxury yachts. You know, that might be something that has a little bit higher price tag. But it does mean then that you can take some of your energy and some of your time and make sure that you're investing in money-making activities that allow you then to spend the rest of your time and energy on those yachts that you love so much. That's the idea here. It's not about telling anybody how to live or how to be. It's not about calling anybody's sense of morality or philosophical purity into question. This is something that is us just being smart with the resources that we have, applying them as correctly as we can, and importantly, making sure that we're applying them in the correct direction. I've seen too many people go through the process of getting rid of all of their stuff only to realize that they got rid of the wrong things. They thought they needed to get rid of their book collection. They thought they needed to get rid of their tools. Like, all of these things that seemed like collections and a lot of kind of pop culture versions of minimalism were telling them, no, get rid of your things, that's too many things. And then they got rid of it and realized their passion was actually woodworking. And now they don't have their woodworking tools anymore. Or their passion legitimately was exposing their friends to new books and having that collection that they could cycle out and share with their friends. That was one of the most meaningful things in their day. It's totally okay. We will all own different numbers of things. That's still minimalism. Minimalism is the philosophy behind it. It's not a certain number of things. The fourth concept. It's another word, and I can't decide if it's a lacuna or not. It's similar. It originally comes from Greek. It was translated into Latin, and now we have an anglicized version of it that is not as fun because it doesn't have that old Greek character, the A and the E combination character. So I'll call it like a pseudo-lacuna. So this pseudo-lacuna is eudaimonia. And eudaimonia is a particular type of pleasure, or happiness derived from that pleasure. And eudaimonia is probably best understood in contrast to another type of more commonly referenced type of pleasure or happiness, hedonic pleasure, hedonism. So hedonism, or hedonic pleasure, is something that is pretty ancient. It's something that we find in other animals. It's a very antique, old part of our brain that is triggered by this particular type of pleasure. And it's something that's very simple. Like in the last 5 years, our ability to scan brains and see processes going on in brains is just remarkable. And most of what we know about brains today comes from the research we've done in the last 5 years. So we're still accumulating data about this, but we already have enough to say several things about this type of pleasure and eudaimonic pleasure. And hedonic pleasure is a relatively simple process that is essentially like pushing a button and dopamine flows. And dopamine is a pleasure chemical. There's other pleasure chemicals that we have as well. And usually it is the animalistic part of our brain's way of rewarding behavior that allows us to survive. And so when we do something that at some point in human history was associated with survival, like seeing somebody that we think is beautiful or eating delicious food, one of them is like, oh, I find this person beautiful. We could probably mate and create an offspring that will survive and pass on our DNA. This is delicious food. I probably find it delicious because it gives me the vitamins and nutrients and fats and sugars that I need to survive. This is aesthetically pleasing. This is probably, this painting, in primordial history, looking at things that we consider to be beautiful, meant that there were no mutations in a lot of cases. So that flower is something I find beautiful because it's something that is not mutated. It's symmetrical. It has colors that I find are probably not associated with anything toxic. So a lot of these behaviors that we have today tie back to something that our primordial brain wanted to reward us for. And so it's a very, very, relatively, for the brain at least, simple process that very consistently gives us a quick shot of dopamine and other pleasure chemicals anytime we trigger it. There's nothing inherently wrong with pleasure of this kind. You can look at a beautiful painting and take a surge of pleasure from seeing something that you think is beautiful. Look at a beautiful person, eat delicious food. That's totally okay. But it is something that is addictive. And I mean that in a very literal sense. It is literally a chemical addiction that is triggered by processes in our brain, and those processes can be triggered by external influences. And a large number of the most successful marketing maneuvers and user interface designs manipulate us by utilizing this process. One of the most common today, I say that, I mean marketing is probably more common, but one of the most common non-marketing permutations of this today is found on most people's front screen of their smartphone. You pull out the phone, and the most visible thing you see is the notifications, right? Usually it's like a red bubble or some kind of color that stands out from all of the other background colors. You pull out that phone, and the first thing that you see is social validation. My community, the tribe that I am a part of, is celebrating me. They like my photos, they've clicked on my whatever, they've shared my stuff. This is important, and this is something that the animalistic part of your brain is like, hell yeah, I'm more likely to survive because the tribe likes me. This is wonderful, what a brilliant state of affairs. Dopamine. And every time we pull out our phones and look at these screens, we're looking for that hit. And it's something that, just like Pavlov's dog, like we can be trained by these types of hits. It's something that, when we explain it like this, it seems almost too simple to possibly work. But if you interrogate a lot of the actions that you take day in and day out, especially in terms of technology and things that are very colorful and graphical, this is why some studies have shown actually that making your phone black and white makes it less addictive. It's because those things that are addictive pop a whole lot less when it's in black and white. It doesn't stand out for most people quite as much. But if you interrogate that and other behaviors, including the things that you buy, the habits, the routines that you have, the cup of Starbucks or whatever that you get every day, like there's a lot of things that all of us do that you can probably track back to this type of chemical addiction. There's an association that we have in the primitive part of our brain that triggers our reward centers anytime we go through this set of processes because we've associated it with that type of hit in the past. And over time, do it a couple of times and we get trained to go through that same behavior completely thoughtlessly. Not because we're idiots, but because we have brains. That's all it is. So hedonic pleasure, though not necessarily something that's inherently bad, is also something that is kind of a leash that allows other people to tug us around and allows us to be manipulated in ways that are not necessarily beneficial for us. Some people try to use it in beneficial ways by gamifying certain educational things that we might do. But that's still us being manipulated. So hopefully that's considered to be not ideal by most people as well. Eudaimonic pleasure is different. It is a completely distinct sense of pleasure that actually utilizes the prefrontal cortex, the very thin, like skin-thin surface on the front of our brain that is the thing that makes us human. This is the part that gives us things like, well, we think consciousness. We don't know that for sure, definitely. But it does give us things like shame. It gives us things like the sense of community and like an upgraded version of pack hunting that leads to tribalism and community and civilization. So it's a lot of our worst attributes and best attributes combined. It comes from this little patch at the front of our brain. That is also the guiding presence behind eudaimonic pleasure. It's an organizational center that then takes a collection of wildly different and disparate electrical activity around different parts of the brain. So while hedonic pleasure is something that looks essentially the same every single time it happens, which is part of what makes it so addictive, eudaimonic pleasure does not rely on pleasure chemicals, and it's a pleasure that we take in that collection of different portions of the brain being activated simultaneously. And it's the same type of pleasure. It looks very similar in the brain when they show this activity using the instrumentation that they have. It looks very similar to the sense of satisfaction that we get when we do something well. So you spend years learning a skill, and then you utilize that skill to build something cool, to save a life, to create a work of art. Utilizing these skills in that way is something that gives us a sense of eudaimonic pleasure. It's also the pleasure that we take when we don't just look at a painting. You look at the painting that's beautiful, and you get a surge of hedonic pleasure, and it's like dopamine, and okay, lovely, I just got a sense of pleasure from something that's beautiful. But then, if you go up to that painting, and you take a look at the brush strokes, and you see how they're applied, and you consider, oh, I wonder if they did it like this. Oh, look at the three-dimensionality. They might have used like a palette knife. And then you read the little thing about the artist, and you figure out who they are and what they were thinking about, and the time period in which they were working, and you make a connection and say, oh, that was during World War II. I wonder if this was informed by that. And the colors they were using. I wonder what chemical compositions they were using, because wasn't that toxic? And you put together all of these pieces, and at a certain point you appreciate the painting in a completely different way than you did before. You're not just looking at the bare, basic, superficial reflection of a collection of colors and shapes. You are appreciating the talent that went into it, the mind behind it. You're applying context and nuance. You're making connections. And this is another thing that our brain rewards us for, but not in the same way. It does not flood us with pleasure chemicals. It's something that we get satisfaction from because we're doing something complex. We're utilizing broad swaths of our brain in ways that we maybe have never utilized them before. And that is something that's very satisfying to us. This is why we like to solve puzzles and make connections and do things well by learning skills. There's a type of television trope called competence porn, where you watch somebody like a doctor show or Sherlock or something like this, and you see somebody doing something really well on the screen and it feels like viscerally satisfying. That's like a mirror neuron response to seeing somebody else do something that you would find eudaimonic pleasure in. Look at that person do that cool thing successfully. And that sense of pleasure that you get from watching that, the reason we call it porn, is because if we were doing the same thing, we would find pleasure in it as well. And our brains have this mirroring thing where we empathize and we say, oh, I bet that would feel like this. And we get to feel a little bit of that backwash. So eudaimonia is a valuable thing to know about. It's interesting, I think, personally. But it's also something that allows us to recognize this contrast. It allows us to see the hedonic pleasure centers in our life, the habits and reflexes that we have, that we might not necessarily want to keep, some of which we might want to keep because they fit well and help us get to where we are going. But having that distinction in place allows us to make that decision. It allows us to look at this thing and say, is this me making the decision, or is somebody else tugging at my leash? Is somebody else manipulating me by my dopamine and causing me to do this thing reflexively? And is there something else that I can replace it with? Can I insert some other replacement into my life that is eudaimonic instead of hedonic? Is there something that I can control that is a more satisfying, complete, complex sense that I could have, but also importantly something that is not addictive? It's something to think about. And it ties in well with the living intentionally thing, you might notice. Now the fifth and final concept. This is one that's not a clever word, it's not cool from another culture or anything, but it is like a revisitation of a common word that we use all the time. Success. The concept of success. It's something that's so common. It's one of those words like freedom or happiness that we kind of toss around in conversation, just assuming that the person on the other end knows what we're talking about. But if you ask 10 different people what their definition for it is, it'll be something completely different. With success, though, most people's definition will probably orient around just a very finite collection of things. just within this society, but also increasingly most cultures around the world that I've encountered at least, most success revolves around some type of power and prestige. It is the accumulation of prestige within your company, within your society. It's the accumulation of resources or some other type of influence, something that gives you power within a society. And it's something that we seek, we pursue like heat-seeking missiles. It's something that we orient our entire lives around the pursuit of this type of success that is, for most of us, I think, inherited, again, by very well-meaning people who want the best for us. But it's also something that's incomplete. I don't think that there's anything wrong with money or having prestige or working hard to be well-known and respected within your society. That's great. It's nice to have enough money to pay for groceries, to pay the rent, to not have to worry about medical bills. That's trickier here in the US than some other places, but I mean, like, there is an amount of money, I think, that would allow us to feel comfortable with that stuff. It's just that for a lot of us, it doesn't stop there. We don't reach a point and say, okay, now that's enough. We have to continue to do it. We need like infinite dollars because we are encouraged to continue to pursue, to continue to amplify. When you make your first million, now you need 10. You make 10, now you need 100. Like, there's always something more and more and more. And that pursuit of success is something that keeps on expanding, rather than it being something that we can accomplish and then move on to another metric of success. And I think for most of us, there are other metrics. Like, this is the kind of thing that causes discontent when we ostensibly have all the things we're supposed to want. You have the money, you have the title, you have whatever, the thing that you've been pursuing. You get it, and it's good for a while, but then in a lot of cases there's something missing. And it's not because we're flawed, and it's not because society sucks or anything like that. It's because we're left with just this one measurement system, and we need more measurement systems. And on top of that, I mean, most of us need a personalized measurement system, because not all of us want the same things. We all want to spend our time in different ways, spend our energy in different ways. We want different people in our lives. We want to do different types of work for different reasons. And that's totally okay. But the idea here is redefining success for you, custom tailoring it, making sure that it's something that fits you rather than it being a one-size-fits-all sort of thing. Just like a shirt off the rack. You could get like an extra large shirt off the rack at any store, and it'll fit over everybody. That doesn't mean it like fits. You know, it might be a tent on some people, it might be too tight on other people. Making something custom tailored is going in and finding all the little nooks and crannies and all the places that it needs to be let out a little bit and extending and shortening. That's what we need to do with our lives in general, but that kind of starts with our definition of what we're pursuing. What metrics of success we actually consider to be most vital. How we measure what we're doing and figure out where we are on that race that we're running. And for essentially all of us, I would assume at least, there might be somebody who bucks this trend, but I would assume all of us, that means that this will be something that we'll continue to pursue forever. It'll be a race that doesn't ever end because it's, you know, a collection of metrics that don't necessarily have an end. But some things might. It might be that we say, I need to earn $70,000 a year and then I'll have everything paid for, I'll have enough put away, I'm making enough to allow for the medical problems I might have someday, I can get that house that I want. But then I can reinvest all of that time I was spending on that one thing on these other things. And this is part of why it's nice to have multiple yardsticks that we're using simultaneously, but also allow ourselves to develop new ones over time. To take a look at the things that we're doing now and say, yeah, things are mostly good, but also I would like to start pursuing this. I'd like to start spending more time with my family. I'd like to start developing new skills in my free time. I want to start making music. I want to learn to write. Any of these other things that you can add in becomes another metric that you can use for success. And allowing ourselves to have these different definitions, these different measurement systems, is something that allows us to cobble together a weird Franken life that looks like us. Something that is me-shaped, something that fits us perfectly, even if it wouldn't fit any other person on the planet. And make sure that we get more of the things that we want and fewer of the things that we don't want. It's being able to look at our actions and see how they reflect us. It's being able to take a look at all of the things that we do day to day and tweak some of them and replace others and extract others completely. It's being able to focus on what's most vital and spend our time, energy, and resources appropriately. And it's being able to go through and figure out which of our behaviors are trained and reflexive and which of them are things that we actually intend to do. And if we can amalgamate all of these things together into one super concept, into one great big lens that we can stare through and see things in a slightly different way, it makes it more likely that as we move from point A to point B, wherever that point B happens to be for each of us individually, We are more likely to benefit not just from the journey, but each and every step that we take in between. Thank you guys so very much.